Well,
translated in like a ton of languages.
that's amazing. Well, whenever I'm building a cohort, that song comes into my head because it's kind of the same back and forth. And you guys are probably like, she's totally crazy. Correct. That's a good characterization. I don't know the diagnosis code for it, but we'll start in the beginning. So for those of you who are playing in here, and I see some of you, people are building different cohorts. So I want to reorient you to Atlas, and we're going to go a little quickly, but we'll back up and talk through a little bit of how we got there. So Atlas, if you recall, is a tool that has many things built into it. I can build cohorts, which is what I'm going to do now. Once I build a cohort, I have these really cool, the screen's not, it's kind of cut off actually. I have these cool things I can do: a cohort pathway, I could do a simple characterization, I could do an incidence rate. You see this thing that says estimation and prediction. Those are types of studies that we talked through a little bit. So we're going to build a cohort, and we are going to start with what I would call the lowest common denominator. So I want you to think about your perfect cohort, and then I want you to think about what is the minimum amount of information we would want to have a good enough cohort, which sounds a little silly because you're probably thinking it has to be perfect if we're going to publish, it has to be amazing. But remember, in OHDSI, we don't have one data asset that we're running against. We have lots of friends who have data everywhere, and we try to think about building a cohort definition that's not just my view of the cohort, it's a view of the cohort I can share and get counts at other places. And maybe that doesn't mean anything, but we'll come back to this. There'll be certain things, certain trade-offs that we might want because it makes a better cohort definition, but it might not be anybody in some of our data sets have those attributes. So let's start from the beginning. You can start by building a new cohort. You might be cheating and already looking at my notes, and that's okay. As long as you don't modify it, if you change my cohort, I will know. We can start with a new cohort, which is, I'm starting with a blank slate. And this cohort is going to be our Hep B patients, right? So I heard one of you say it could be a measurement. Oh, it could be, I think, what did you also say? It could be did someone say a procedure? Remind me, what were the attributes we said that it could show up as? I heard measurements. What was the other ones? Blood test is a measurement. Drugs, maybe? There were some drugs? Okay. But I just have a simple question. Why not start with a diagnosis code? Any reservations why you wouldn't use a condition occurrence? Any thoughts? I'm simple. I'm just an epidemiologist. I'm not a clinician. But usually if there is a diagnosis code, I tend to like to start with a diagnosis code. I could add more criteria for drugs and measurements, but the more things I want, the greedier I get about my definition, the more likely I am to get 0 sometimes because perhaps measurements aren't coded in a lot of data sets. Does that make sense? Kind of. And I guess I'm just asking, would you trust a diagnosis code if a physician said, maybe they've ordered the measurement, the blood test, and then they've come back and they're talking with the patient and they say, this person has hepatitis. Is that a pretty reasonable use of that condition occurrence, do you guys think? Yeah? So in Atlas, if we go back to the thought, we can select a criteria for a condition occurrence. So we're finding patients with a specific diagnosis. So perhaps we could build a world where we say, I want the blood test before, and then they have this. That might be more precise. But we're going to start simple. We're going to just look for, does the physician code that they have had hepatitis. And so you might recall this idea of having concepts or clinical terms built into these little bricks. And I have a whole library of concept sets that I can retrieve. And I might already be fortunate enough to have let's see if I can spell it. I might already have one. Or I should. Or, I'm going to cheat. I'm going to save this for a second. I need to attribute, so right now I have the logic of I want to see a diagnosis of, but Atlas is not smart enough to know what diagnosis. So I have to put that concept set with it or else it's not smart enough. I have to go check why I can't find my concept set. So in a perfect world, you and your colleagues have already started building code sets that you trust because you do a lot of research and you use them a lot. So you would call that the concept set. So I might have a colleague who says, whoops, this is fancy. I might have a colleague who says, I helped you. I'm an expert in hepatitis. I think these are, let me make this a little bigger. It's a little, they say, I really like these OMOP concepts. I think you should use these for your analysis. Does anyone remember the difference between standard and non-standard? Anyone remember anything Mui taught yesterday? Speak up. Color. Yeah, color is actually a very true. That's the first start. Yeah, so blue is standard. The magenta or maroon is non-standard. But even simpler, non-standard is the local source system way of saying your thing you're looking for, and the standard is your interoperable or your shared way of finding that clinical thing. So we have some concepts here. I'm not going to make you guys validate these, but in some cases, you may go through an exercise with your team to decide, is this the best code possible? And you'll notice, does anyone remember what descendants are? Does anyone remember what that means? Yes, descendants do have ancestors, but what does it mean in the context of this type B viral hepatitis? What am I doing by clicking descendants? Does anyone remember? Exactly. You get an A+. So by clicking the descendants, I'm saying not just this level of detail, but the things that are below it, I would like to pull that into my definition of hepatitis. So, yeah.
Like, because you have exclude and descendants both like that.
Yes. So I'll go back. Let me pull up my concept set for you.
Explain on that.
So you can put in a concept set both things you are looking for and things you absolutely do not want in the same thought, which sounds a little bit maybe contradictory because you would think exclusion, things don't go, not together. If they're in the same domain, you can start a concept set and build a piece of logic. And by clicking exclude, I say, I do not want this specific clinical concept, and I don't want its children either. And I want that for a series of concepts that my expert consensus has said, these ones are not reliable. This isn't the type of patient we're looking for. That would be why you would include them in your concept set for hepatitis. You'd say, these are the truth, but these ones are things that look like it, but are not really what I'm looking for. So I want to exclude them explicitly.
And also there's, so
Yep.
that's why you check that box.
Yep, exactly. I don't want just this level of detail. I want all of the more specific things that are underneath it. And I want from that point up, or from that point down. And it's important because I could leave out the descendants, but you'll notice the included concept says 17. If I took off the descendants, I'd probably lose a few. Let's see how fast I can think. I'm taking advantage of that really hard work that the vocabulary team for for OHDSI has done. And so they have helped me create kind of what goes in to this map. And simply taking advantage of the descendants means I'm taking advantage of all that hard work they've done to relate clinical things that are like each other. So I see all sorts of things here. Does anyone remember what DRC? I think you've explained that yesterday. I'm pretty sure when we went through this. Does anyone remember what this is? Any guesses? Speak up. I'm old, I can't hear you. Descendant, does someone say descendant record counts? Is that? It's not the Democratic Republic of Congo, but yes, this is all the things that are at that level of detail in your data. So the cool thing about Atlas is it's looking at your local CDM, and it's telling you in your data, this is the most common term that hepatitis is coded with. And here are all the things below it. So this is at that level and below it, and it's all those levels of detail. So why is that helpful? I don't always know if my perfect concept that I like, that code that I'm like, yes, type B viral hepatitis, is that good? I don't always know that. I might need to look at the frequency that something shows up to be able to know if it makes sense. So in this case, we know this is used a lot, right? This is a large amount of coded instances of that disease. But this may be where you find, when you're looking at something like a blood test, you see zeros everywhere. You think, why do I have 0? And it could be you don't have blood tests loaded into your data mart, or you didn't convert that data yet, or you just have drugs and conditions. There are a lot of logical reasons why you have zeros that don't mean it doesn't occur in real life. It just means in your data, you only have certain things to work with. So we like this concept set. We like it a lot. I'm actually going to copy it. And what's really cool about concept sets, I can share them with other people. So perhaps I'm working with another researcher and I say, hey, Patrick, can you give me your expert view of how to code hepatitis B? I'm building this study. So Patrick can actually send me a JSON file, which you don't have to know what JSON stands for. It's just a way to take all of that concept expressed together. And you can actually take that thing, you can save it as a text file, and you can, in your own cohort, take advantage of it. I don't know, where am I? People are, I see you guys. You're all in here. Good, I'm glad you're playing with the tool. That's the most fun. So what does it mean? It means, let's say Patrick gave me that concept set. And I decide I want to borrow it for this cohort. I can import exactly what he gave me. Oh, I see. It doesn't like me like that. Let's see. Import. I thought I pasted your, there it goes. So I have to do a couple clicks in the UI, and then I have it. I have that knowledge piece that I didn't have to work hard. Now I have to put it into my thought. So I'm looking for a condition occurrence of hepatitis B, right? That's a diagnosis of hepatitis. And now I might ask myself some questions. How much time do I want this person to be in, these people to be in the data set? What's my window? 100 days, someone suggests. That's before and after, cumulatively? Like, is it from diagnosis prior, after, both? Any other thoughts? I don't know hepatitis super well. I might need more help with this? Do other people have thoughts on the amount of time you want to see that hepatitis patient? I'm like listening for your whispers. You guys are so shy. It's okay to say it out loud. So I might decide I want a full year.
So let me ask, since this is your question. When you ask for patients with hepatitis B who goes on to have the liver cancer, what was your entry event for the hepatitis B? Was it the first time that they had hepatitis B? Or was it, how did you think about defining your cohort entry criteria? First time? Okay.
First time.
And so if we are interested in somebody's first time of observing something in their medical history, one useful trick that we often use is that you could require to see something for the first time, but you also require that a person exist in the database for some period of time such that you have confidence that it is truly new and the first time. So what Kristin's asking about is how much time would we want someone to be in the database before their first time of having hepatitis B? How long would you need to see someone not have the disease until you would be confident that when you do observe it, that it must probably be their first time? Do you think of watching someone in the database for a year without having the disease would give you confidence that now the first time you see it? Or do they need to be watched for 3 years? Or yeah, we're not yet at the liver. I understand the liver cancer. I'm just saying, to have confidence that you're looking at a person who has new hepatitis B. So,
I use the medical terminology.
okay.
Yeah.
潜伏期，就是说临床感染以后，什么时候血小能变成阳性，对吧？我也觉得半年。
Half a year.
Okay. Okay.
That means you have a real virus infection until blood test and come out positive signals. That's about half a year or maximum.
Okay. So, how do we do that? Well, first, in addition to having the condition occurrence, so having the diagnosis of hepatitis B, I also want to make sure I add an attribute that it's limited to new diagnosis. And this red X, super confusing. It's not no, even though that's usually what X means. It's just a way to get rid of your attributes. So that may be super confusing. It is. We've given some feedback to the next design of Atlas that maybe red X's mean something different than they thought. But this means I have this condition, so I have a diagnosis of Hep B for the first time in my person's history. And then this is the question we were asking. How much time do I want in the database prior to that qualifying event? So we said half a year, you could do a full year. Spoiler, there is no right or wrong answer. It is your clinical expertise about what you're looking for that will guide you to what window makes sense. In really, really acute diseases, you might only have 30 days or 60 days. And so what we've set up here is a cohort entry event for this condition for the first time. And we might decide, is one diagnosis of hepatitis enough? Is that really a case? Do you trust that clinician that one time they coded it in their medical record? And it's not you, it's any clinician. So, you know, you can pretend you're perfect, but what if your colleague doesn't code well? Do we think one time of hepatitis is enough? No? Yep. So we might see it come up 2 to multiple times to become a true diagnosis. A single instance may not be a case, it may be a screen. So what we could do is restrict the initial event to, so this is saying, in addition to meeting the criteria we've put above, which is that diagnosis for the first time in a half-year look back, we can then add another condition occurrence of hepatitis B, and we could say 0 days before and all days after, or we could specify within a certain amount of time. So is there a reasonable amount of time between multiple screenings? Is it small? Is it large? Like, is it closer to 30 days? Is it a week? What would be the right time after to look for that second code? Okay. So up to 3 months. We could do 120 days. We could actually do, would you ever have a situation where you wouldn't want to include the day of diagnosis? You'd want to look from 1 day after and forward. Does that make sense? Is there any reason why we would want to put that in? Can we? I don't know clinically. I know for some diseases you don't look at the day of diagnosis and you look from every day forward. But I'm not sure that this needs that. What do you guys think? Okay. So what we've done then is adjust the event start to say it has to happen on a different day, so the day after the first time it comes up, and within 120 days of that initial diagnosis. And what we're saying is I want at least one, but this will give me anyone who is in excess of 1 or more. I could be more strict, I could pick higher numbers, but I would say use your clinical judgment on how likely it is that a physician would record that same thing many, many times, and that should guide you to what the right kind of threshold is. So I'm going to save this, but how are we feeling? Do we think, I know I said this is kind of a crude definition, but how are we feeling? Are we starting to feel like we kind of know how we're pulling these building blocks together? Is there anything I would want to do in addition to this initial cohort entry event and the restricting here? Is there anything else I might want to do for this cohort? Any other qualifying criteria? Do we care about the age they are, the gender, anything like that?
Family history, like if their parents have HPV infection, particular mom, and the children as an infant born as HPV by infected mom, that's higher incidence of have for liver cancer. So family history, whether his mom is HPV is high risks.
Okay. And in the data that you guys work with, how regularly do you see parents and child together?
In China, it's very high. In the US, it's very, very low.
Yeah. Because I almost never see people's relatives. In fact, I see a very de-identified version of them. If we were running a study on other data sets, this is a question. Does the familial linkage, is that really important to the question? Because we could add that. If it isn't, it's a question because that's when we get too strict, and we'll just get zeros on some data. I bet if Patrick or I ran that in our data, although some of your data sets have mother child.
You don't need linkage, you just need, it's an observation, family history.
But for infants, I feel like we wouldn't have infant coverage, like they wouldn't be a unique person.
Yeah, I don't know.
Is that mostly in young pediatrics, the family history? Does it ever get used in adults? Okay. We could try it. Because we likely will not have people, like if it's only a code, family history is only used in children, and especially young children. Most network sites that you would do a study with would not have infant data in addition to the parent data. And if they did, they might have all sorts of special rules about how we use it because kids are special, right?
So I guess we need to think about how we're using a criteria, because we would now be saying all people have to have this criteria. So are you interested in saying amongst people who have a hepatitis B, all people also have to have a family history? Or are you saying you have to have, or are we trying to say you either have a diagnosis or you have a family history?
Okay,
You want it as an or.
we could do that. Any guesses where family history goes in the CDM? Anyone remember? Yeah. Yes. That was actually kind of a trick question because sometimes I forget where family history goes. But yeah, it's an observation, right? So we could do, whoops. Ah. So we could do an observation of, and we need to create a concept set for family history. So I might look for the codes that relate to that. How likely is it that somebody would get just a family history and then another code of that diagnosis? Like, because the way we have our criteria written right now, we would have to have them fulfill family history, so, or they either had the initial hepatitis diagnosis or a family history, and then they also have to have one diagnosis of hepatitis after that. That's what we have right now. Do we feel that might be plausible or real? Are we not sure? And I'm not sure what. I'll look for hepatitis. In the overview. It should have the vocabs in here though. All right, so we have a measurement panel. We could put a measurement criteria in too if we'd like, but we're really looking for Hep B. And we would want to filter by domain. Yep. So I don't see a well-used observation here. I don't see anything with any frequency that relates to family history. So I'm choosing the observation domain. We can choose standard. I don't see any codes that would be useful, and some of these are not even the right hepatitis because we had just hep. We might not use that criteria if we notice there are no records that code for that, right? We could if we wanted, if we thought somebody else might have that, but in our data, I don't see it used much. So what do we think? Should we leave that out? Yeah. Okay. There's no right or wrong answer here. It's a test of trying to build a cohort together. So, all right. let's get rolling on the fun part. Okay, so I'm gonna save my cohort. So, you know what's cool about Atlas? I can spend a lot of time going through the screen, clicking all these selections, adding all my criteria. I can also, when I'm done, actually export it in plain, less sophisticated view. So I can actually just put it as a PDF if I wanted to share that with some of my colleagues, and all the codes I used are here, which is kind of cool. I can also get these really cool graphical views that tell me exactly what I'm doing with my criteria. Somebody want to try to read what this says? Does anyone have any guess? So this is time 0, right? Your index or your qualifying event. And so your first thing is having that diagnosis. That's your primary criteria. And then we've set the look back window of 180 days. So that's what we see on both of these. And at this point, we also want one more diagnosis after that. So I think that's pretty cool. I'm really terrible at drawing these charts myself, so it's kind of nice to have a tool do it for you. So the only thing I didn't ask you is, how do you leave the cohort? How do you leave? Somebody said you want to follow them until as much time as humanly possible. So would I want to just keep them in for as long as we see them in our data set? Would that be useful? Perhaps. You could censor if there was something else that you would say, this thing happening to this cohort is very, very different and makes them a very different population. But I think our cohort is pretty simple. We want them to have hepatitis, and we want to be sure they have hepatitis, and we don't really care about too much else, because this is just the hepatitis cohort. Do we agree? I've seen some nods. So if you wanted to, you could generate this against the data. You could run it and get a count. And while we're doing that, we could also build one more cohort, because we have to build 2, right? So remind me, liver cancer. Would you say HCC is kind of what you meant by liver cancer, or were you thinking even more broadly? It's okay to say HCC? So what if you had a colleague who said, hey, I did a project on liver cancer last year. Here is my cohort. You could take a look. So this particular cohort is equally simple. It's the condition occurrence of liver cancer. And so what do we mean by that? We see liver cell carcinoma, hepatocellular carcinoma, and then we exclude for secondary malignant neoplastic disease. They excluded for skin cancer. Seems pretty reasonable, right? Oops, I keep touching the weirdest stuff. Okay. So why would we reuse someone's cohort definition? Sometimes it saves us a lot of time. And what's really great about OHDSI, there are huge studies that have already been run that have cohorts already built that are essentially validated because they've done other analyses with them. And it can save you a lot of time if you find one you like and you say, you know what, this works. So this is our outcome cohort. So we're really just looking for the occurrence of the outcome, right? And pop quiz, do we understand how the two relate to each other? Why we made one for the target diagnosis and why we're making one for the outcome? No, I see a shaking head. No, that's fair. So why are we separating them, right? Because we want to create this set of logic related to the thing we're looking for. So if we go back to these questions, so Patrick bolded some things because we're ultimately looking for people, among people who meet a cohort definition, who are the people who become part of a smaller cohort of those people. But I don't need to put this with this because I can use the OHDSI methods library to relate the two things together. I just need a really good definition of what my outcome is, and I need a really good definition of who I'm pulling in. Feeling good? You guys are such a tough read at this hour of the day. So I'm looking at my cohort, and I honestly feel like this guy is fine. This is simple enough. I can look and see how many people in my data match this definition. And I can close this and come back to the other cohort and see how many folks. So I have 881 people in my 23 million patient data set that meet my basic diagnosis code and the second diagnosis code definition. This is synthetic data. It's not real people. It's fake, but it looks like real people. But maybe I don't trust my numbers. Maybe I think this data is funky. So the thing I could do, pass this over. I could go into, let's say I'm collaborating. Let's see if I can. I'm trying to see if, is this right? Let's see. Find out. I think this is my Atlas. So Atlas is a tool that many people can have. You can trade, that's not my right Atlas. Is it IMS? I just can't remember the string. I think it's this. Yes. All right, so this Atlas looks the same, but it's actually different because I have lots of data in it because I own data. And so I might trade this definition around and ask somebody to say, hey, in your data, what does it look like? And that's the fun of OHDSI. Once I build it, once I write my right password, let's see if I can.
So just so that everybody's clear about this, it's one piece of software called Atlas that anybody in the world can install on their own computer, and then their own computer is where they could have access to their data. So everybody can install the same software on their computer. And what Kristin's showing now is she happens to be using the same computer to point to two different versions of Atlas. The one that you guys have access to has fake data. The one that she's now logging into has real data. But because it's the same exact software, researchers can share files and be able to run the study that is designed at one location and execute it at a different location.
It's pretty cool, right? And this is what Patrick was saying when they went to go, you guys sat in a bar, you opened your independent atlases, traded some cohorts, and within minutes, they had counts and they were starting to play with, does this look like it works? So, I'm going to grab the one more. So, you will iterate regularly on your cohort definition. It will never be perfect because real world data is real world. Things happen. I think our cohorts are going to be quite good in my data. And I'll let you know in just a second. Reload. And I know I'm going fast. The good news is there's really cool videos on the OHDSI website that Patrick made that are like 5-10 minutes. Same stuff I'm clicking through, but in recap. So if you like what this is, but you are not, you're like, she's moving so fast, don't worry. There's all sorts of resources to go back. And this is usually in itself, we do whole multi-day workshops on cohort creation. So let's see, I'm gonna fire this off. I'm gonna go look at the other one. So what am I doing now? I wanna just see if this theoretical definition I made up works. Because the hardest part of the study is figuring out, do patients actually meet? And my Atlas is probably not fast enough for all the firing I did, but that's okay. We'll give it a second. So, my cohort may not be your favorite cohort, but does it make sense, the framework that we're working through? Like you guys were looking at this cohort design worksheet. Are we starting to understand sort of what is the initial entry event? What are those additional things? And what is exit? Is that starting to make sense? And what I can see after it comes back is I start to get counts for how this looks in different types of data. So why is that important? Sometimes I might create a cohort that only exists in ambulatory interactions with your healthcare provider. Sometimes I might create a cohort that is basically a hospitalization related cohort. And I might have everything in between that's just things that are routine healthcare interactions. And so some of the questions that we pulled up before are good questions if the data can be found. And that's the hardest part sometimes. So some of our endpoints, we have to think about what data, how do I measure this? How could this turn into a domain? And how likely is it that other people will also have this in addition to just me, if you want to run a bigger network study? You can run a study just on your internal, your institution, but as we're building a prediction model, we might want to run an internal validation and then externally validate that same model, which is maybe what we might do in the next day or two. So I'm going to stop talking, and I think we're going to get them engaged with designing. You have 15, yeah. So actually, what are the questions you guys have? Is this starting to make sense?
So the moment when we enter a new cohort, it will be somebody have same topics that there's a way to remind us that, hey, someone is also have a similar cohort. You guys may talk.
So I wish Atlas was like Google and it's like, did you mean or did you know? We're not there yet, but the way you start is actually, if you're thinking of a cohort and you're working through it on your local Atlas, you could go to the OHDSI forum, go to the researcher tab and say, I am doing, so like here's one I started the other day, I'm doing a mammography. Sorry, so I actually built a cohort. There's a public Atlas, which is just odyssey.org/web/atlas. This is totally free. And you could put your cohort, take that JSON, you could import it here, and you could start sharing that to other collaborators and say, hey, is anyone doing anything similar? Or, hey, I don't know if my concept set is good, I'm kind of confused. I do that a lot. That's actually what this forum post is. I was saying, hey, I'm not the greatest at procedure codes. Are these the right procedure codes for mammography? And there was a debate. Whoops, I'm not good at this machine. There was a debate then on kind of, did you pull in the right stuff? But it all starts with making it kind of saying to the external world, I'm doing this study. Does anybody have any thoughts? So the forum and the researcher spot is a good place to go. You could also probably just email Lingyi and say, hi, I am interested in this. Do you know anyone who has that? And he may.
Let's not try to make it easy to that. It's best if you guys put it in the WeChat group.
There you go.
The China working group. Or what I want, you guys post in the forums.
Yes.
What I would prefer is you guys post in the forums, because then you're not the only one, and other
That's true.
that they're going to do their own thing. I know you guys use WeChat a lot here for a lot of stuff, but if you really want to collaborate with, other people in other countries, it's best to put things out there, right? So like I said, we type Chinese and they'll stick it into Google Translate because we are allowed to use Google Translate, and they'll translate it because like Patrick said, Chris does that, Kristin does that, Christian does that. They will actually take Korean, translate it, type it, translate it back to Korean, and post it.
So it might be bad grammar, but we will try to respond to you.
They do try a lot to get other countries involved, so it would be best. And why Atlas doesn't do everything it's supposed to do, right? 我说过了，昨天说过了，是免费的，是一般 IT 人自己做的，不是有人给钱给他们去做一个很棒、很漂亮的工具，只是他们觉得我们做了那么多研究，做了那么多这些，如果有一个工具的话，就可能更多人可以去做。所以这个 Alice 呢，怪怪的，有很多怪怪的behavior， 因为那些人呢都是自己有自己的时间去做的 ，right？ 如果你看的话，有人给钱的 quality 会更很多，可是如果你自己去做的，我就马马虎虎做了就行。Okay? So that's why Atlas is not the coolest thing, but it is also what it is. It is built by a community and does have its little quirks. But if you guys want to do better, feel free. Join it. Let us know. We can build a better one.
It's free.
All I know is that Louis I am the one responsible for developing the Atlas platform. So all I know is that Louis just talked crap about my software.
In Chinese, yeah.
In Chinese, so I don't know what she said.
Yeah.
So if you wouldn't mind pulling up your IQVIA instance.
Yes.
So while we were doing this, I just
Let
did
me
a quick
refresh
literature
this.
search. And so there is a paper published in the top hepatology journal, the Journal of Hepatology, has an impact factor of 18.5, so very, very important journal. And the paper is called Incidence of Hepatocellular Carcinoma in Chronic Hepatitis B Patients Receiving Nucleotide Therapy, a Systematic Review. And in that paper, they summarized all of the prior published work that summarized the incidence of hepatocellular carcinoma and chronic hepatitis B. And I'm going to read the statement from the results. 21 studies included 3,881 treated patients and 534 untreated patients met our criteria. It then goes on to give us the estimate of the effect. So, top journal, summarizing everything that's known, which is based on 4,000 patients. What we just did in 25 minutes,
This is your count of.
Kristin just found there is a database that she has access to that has 18,000 patients who have chronic hepatitis B. So in 25 minutes, we identified a real-world data set that has 5 times more data.
Or
than the
500 times.
500 times more data.
Yeah, we have.
Than all of the data that's summarized in the highest impact journal for hepatology. Now, why is that? Well, these, going back to this morning when we talked about our purple pill and white pill example, these are carefully done experiments to try to measure this very carefully. These are not going to be just retrospective analysis of existing data that's captured. And for that reason, we have to think about the consequences of that. On the flip side, this is saying that what we know about the incidence of hepatocellular carcinoma is based on a pretty small fraction of data. And so the opportunity that we could consider is how could we contribute to the literature and contribute to this high impact journal is by summarizing what do we observe in the real world when we ask the same question, how often do we see hepatocellular carcinoma in patients with hepatitis B? And at least a part of our novel contribution could be that we have more data than just 3,000 patients. Because in fact we have 30,000 patients.
And this is for HCC.
And we have data in the United States, and data in hospital systems, and data in EHRs, and data in claims. We might have data in other parts of the world. And therefore, we might be able to provide a more complete picture of that study. It starts, though, with our ability to have confidence that when we say we're finding people with chronic hepatitis B, that we have confidence that we believe that those people really do have hepatitis B. And when we go and find people with hepatocellular carcinoma, we have to have some level of confidence that those people really do have hepatocellular carcinoma. But if we can convince ourselves and convince the peer reviewers that we can create good cohort definitions that represent those diseases, then we can answer this characterization question, which is good enough to be published in a top-tier journal, which means updating it with better data around the world could also be published in a high-impact journal. And more importantly, we can do it in a way that will allow us to actually not only answer your characterization question that you're interested in, but we can also think about, now that we have a cohort definition for hepatocellular carcinoma, which we ultimately, multiple of you have questions about, and we also have a cohort for hepatitis B, now we have these building blocks that now we can ask different types of questions. So we could follow up your characterization question with the prediction question. Which patients go on to have hepatocellular carcinoma? Or we could ask the estimation question. Which antiretroviral therapy is more effective in reducing hepatocellular carcinoma? So building these building blocks these cohorts as building blocks become the tools that we can actually use to put together important research questions and allow us to answer them.
Woohoo! Anyone else excited? I don't know. Gotta let out a woohoo. Almost. So.
Let's see. How much time do we have, Marie? We have 10 minutes?
You have 20. Lots of them.
Do we want to do evaluation? I'm not really sure. Talk through it just a little bit. Yes. I'm more important. Do we want to talk through it, or do we want to actually just have them play with their own cohorts?
Maybe play with their own cohorts.
Okay.
I feel like it might be above.
That's fine, yeah. Okay, so
Here.
what we're going to do for the last 20 minutes is we want you to work on your own cohorts in Atlas. So you guys have phenotypes that you want to create. Want you to take time in Atlas to log in and create your cohorts. If you have any questions, either about what type of data might be available for your question or how to search the vocabulary, just raise your hand and flag down Louis or Kristin or myself, and we'll come help you with it. If you want to think about your question a little bit more, we want to help you. The purposes of today is to get you comfortable with the idea of how to define a cohort, both conceptually, meaning answer these questions on a piece of paper, and from an implementation perspective, putting it into Atlas. So that's what we want to focus on today. Just to give you a preview of what we're going to be doing tomorrow. Tomorrow morning, we're going to teach you how to perform characterization studies. So we will get the answer to your question tomorrow morning.
Yay.
Now that we've created the cohorts, we will be able to actually answer the question, how often do we observe hepatocellular carcinoma in patients with chronic hep C? We will also tomorrow learn how to design prediction studies. So we will be able to make a prediction of which patients get hepatocellular carcinoma following hep C. Okay? But for right now, so if you're interested in talking about your question, we're happy to help you. But for right now, what we really want you to focus on is make sure you can create your cohort definitions so that you understand what those disease targets targets are that you want to study. Okay? So we'll take the last 20 minutes of class to have you work in Atlas and play with that. And if anybody has any questions, feel free to raise your hand and we'll come around and help you. Okay?
And if you have no idea what Patrick is saying, Jing might be able to tell you what he means.
Yes.
And if you forgot